Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me first thank Mr. Black and Mr. Watson for your service to this country, and please convey to people back at headquarters and in the field our thanks. You both articulated very well the pride that you have in your men and women, and we have that same pride. If you can convey that to them, we would appreciate it very much. To Mr. Watson, let me say a special thanks to you as you, for your many years of service as you begin your retirement, and certainly wish you well. I know that our witnesses today and the witnesses we've had during these hearings, that to them and to you, this committee must look like 37 Monday morning quarterbacks. And we all know how much players and coaches dislike Monday morning quarterbacking. But I guess to some extent that is the nature of inquiries such as this. In my 20 minutes today, I want to focus on the future. On the future. Because as we all know, no amount of Monday morning quarterbacking will change the tragedy of September 11th. I think it's only useful to look at past mistakes so that we can learn from them, so that we can take steps to prevent a future September 11th. What has been unspoken, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, what has been unspoken in this room throughout these public hearings is this. Whatever intelligence failure there was a failure not just of the intelligence agencies, not just of the FBI, but also a failure of Congress and a failure of presidents. It's been a failure to prioritize. It's been a failure to have enough vision. It's been a failure of resources. In the 1970s, many public hearings were held, and I happen to believe there were some good reforms that were made, but I also happen to believe that there was a chilling impact made on our intelligence operations. And the value of covert operations and the value of good human intelligence was certainly de-emphasized. The end of the Cold War, the peace dividend, that term was used. That peace dividend was taken out of the hide not only of the defense of this country, but also out of our intelligence agencies. And sometimes we forget that. We simply did not understand the new world that we lived in. We didn't understand that the danger that we were living in was just as dangerous as what we all grew up in. We grew up in the Cold War. The enemy was communism, the Soviet Union. We understood it. We fought it. We won. We didn't understand that there were other enemies out there. We understood it, but we just didn't, I guess, react. We didn't understand the need for covert action, the need for human intelligence. They were just as important now as they had ever been. I guess in a sense we thought that the long twilight struggle that John Kennedy talked about was over. But the danger to freedom does in fact continue. It is out there. We simply did not provide the resources. I have gone back. I've gone back to 1988 and looked at the budget figures. And I'm not going to talk about those budget figures in specifics today, obviously. But the budget, simply what you find when you looked at what the President proposed and what Congress did, what was enacted into law, you find that, frankly, there's enough blame to go around for both Congress and the President. Presidents. And that none of us really got it. And that we just didn't provide the resources. let me ask, if I could, Mr. Watson, you talked about resources. Let me ask actually both of you, both Mr. Watson and Mr. Black, a specific question, that is, how much bigger should the counterterrorism units be? If we're serious about providing defense, Mr. Watson's made a very good point. There's no guarantees. We understand that. We can't guarantee we're going to stop every terrorist attack. But they've grown. We've reacted. But if we look at this the way we ought to be looking at it in Congress, and the way your departments, agencies should be looking at it, where should we be 2 years from now, 5 years from now? What kind of growth should we expect to see? Mr. Black?
Yes, sir. A key point, at least from my agency's end, is that I need to underscore that it is more than just the Counterterrorism Center. The Counterterrorism Center essentially is a resource provider. We provide expertise, we provide people with special languages, special skills. When the going gets tough, we get called in, things like that. But we operate essentially through others, through the Operations Directorate and our field station. So the answer actually is that we need to increase the base for the long haul. We need more resources for the Operations Directorate, upon which CTC can achieve its objectives. I would say everything at, just me personally talking, I'd say that the organization could easily absorb a 100% increase in terms of personnel and resources.
Where you are today.
Where we are today. And that should not be, I know you're very interested in this, sir, but that should not necessarily be considered the end. That is a good beginning, and that's an absorption rate. And that could take us for the next 3 to 5 years.
I think your point is very, very interesting, and you've made this point to me in private before, that we're not just talking about the Counterterrorism Center itself, that you have to operate with support around the world.
Yes, sir.
And you've also made the point to me, Mr. Black, and I won't belabor it, that you cannot increase yours without increasing what surrounds you, but also vice versa.
Also vice versa. We are dependent on each other, us being the smaller partner.
So when we examine your budget, we need to keep that in mind.
If you would, sir, that would be good.
Mr. Watson, you want to comment on that at all? I know you don't like to get into a lot of speculation, but...
Sure, Senator. Something in your introduction, though, I would like to reflect back on real quick, and I think a lot of times we lose sight of the fact. During this period of time, if you look at it, and we used to talk about it, Mike Rollins and I used to talk about this, is that we're pushing a program where we get up and actually admit that more Americans were probably murdered in Chicago than killed as a result of terrorist acts against Americans. And so that perspective is a lot of where we were in the process, because the political will was, we've got gang problems here in D.C. and in Detroit, I mean, whatever that situation is. So no one really looked at this, and they looked at the numbers, and I in no way want to talk that the numbers aren't important of the number of Americans killed. But if you look at the numbers compared to what else was going on, there was nobody sitting there saying, holy smokes, when someone attacks and kills 3,000 Americans, the gloves come off. And that's it. But let me go back.
And both your agencies have big priorities.
Yes.
Mr. Black has other priorities, or
sure.
His agency has other priorities.
And there are other priorities. Okay. All right, let me answer your question real quick. A typical bureaucratic answer is we need 1,000 times more than what we have. I think the answer to your specific question is, where do we need to be in 2 years? I think is an accountability piece that you should hold our organization accountable for. And when it's time for budget to say, we need 150 analysts, we should articulate to you what they're going to be doing. And we need an additional 400, rather than the normal process of saying we need 400 agents. And there's nothing wrong with that. What we need to do is look beyond the horizon over the next 2 to 3 years out, to include the cyber arena.
Mr. Black, talk to me a little bit about the strategic long-term thinkers and what that ratio should be to the tactical side. Analysts.
Analysts. We have underinvested in strategic only because we've had such near-term threats. The trend is always towards the tactical. We need to put additional resources. Units have been established doing this now. The tactical is where the lives are saved. It is not necessarily a commonly accepted, but strategic analysis is not the compelling entity that gets you to saving lives. I would say a good ratio to be worked towards with increased resources would be something the ratio of like 1 to 4, 1 to 5.
Is that where we are today?
No, we're the ratio is greatly imbalanced. We are something like 1 to 8, something like that.
Let me ask both of you. The impression that I think the public would get, and people watching this would get, or listening to this, or reading about it, of these hearings, would be that there were a lot of facts out there, and this investigation has brought all those facts together. Things going on here, things going on there, and the impression is that if they had all been brought together by the intelligence community, by the FBI, and had brought together into one place, and one person had looked at them, that September 11th could have been prevented. And I want to know if you can address that perception, whether that is, in your opinion, based on what we now know, whether that is true or not. Mr. Black?
That is a question certainly that we all need to look at very closely.
If it can be answered.
It's difficult. We always try to, it's very popular to use the term connect the dots. It means a lot of things to a lot of different people. The object here is to get to tactical warning. And tactical warning is very difficult. Tactical warning requires specific details. Analysis can give you strategic warning. It is specific intelligence information that is actionable for my colleague in the FBI so he can do something about it, take specific action. The strategic is essentially related to infrastructure support. You want to put more emphasis on the protection of containers or aircraft or trucks. I think the emphasis on strategic will continue, but I would say that the tactical is where the lives are saved. Sir?
But what should the public take away from this? Because that is the perception out there. Mm-hmm. I want to know your opinion about it. Reasonable minds can differ. I'm curious to know what yours is.
That's a difficult question, and I come out on the side with the status of the resources we had at the time and the technology we had at the time and the ability to analyze and process information. I come out tactically, we couldn't have prevented it.
Is there one?
Now,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, Senator.
No, you finish.
If we had 10,000 analysts, I might come out a different way in this thinking. But again, as I mentioned earlier, looking specifically hindsight 2020 after an event, it's pretty easy to draw the lines. It's pretty easy to say, you guys should have done this. But if you're looking in a sea of red flags of 1,000 things, and I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
As you both know, Senator Kyle and Senator Schumer have proposed a modification of the FISA law to allow surveillance of terrorists who are not explicitly connected to a foreign group. I very much support that fix. I think it is the correct thing to do. I'd like to know if either one of you have looked at that.
I fully support that idea.
All right, Mr. Black, have you looked at it or not? I'm sorry.
I do. I support it. The little that I know of it, I've not made a detailed study of it.
Thank you very much. We've heard testimony this week, Mr. Watson, from our Joint Investigation Committee that during the months prior to September 9th, the Counterterrorism Section at the FBI headquarters sent out a request to 24 field offices asking them to investigate information that headquarters had received about a terrorist organization which was planning to send students to the U.S. for aviation training. But the request received little or no action. Further, The Joint Investigation Committee found that such a lack, or the staff found that such a lack of response was not uncommon because the field offices have a great deal of control over what they do and often ignore headquarters requests. I wonder if you could comment on that. Is that true? And if so, what are we doing to assert certain more control with regard to national priorities such as terrorism?
Specifically, if you're referring to what's been, I'm sure, testified up here before about the specific facts of that request that came in, my answer is I'm glad the agent sent it in. But if you look at what he was saying in that information, there was nothing in there that would have caused us to open a specific case and go after that specific group of individuals at that time. And the idea that someone says that the field ignores headquarters, that's not totally accurate. There is requirements that the field report to headquarters. They have reporting requirements. We have reporting requirements to the Department of Justice. Where the Office of Origin is gives a lot of latitude to that office. But if it's a counterterrorism matter, it also has a lot of focus from FBI headquarters. Granted, a stolen car ring case is totally different, and if it's in Knoxville, Knoxville can handle that. But a counterterrorism case in Little Rock requires input from headquarters. And I don't know, but that's where we come out with that.
We heard testimony last week from Secretary Armitage and Secretary Wolfowitz that both of them believe one of the biggest problems with our intelligence analysis is that the agencies strive for consensus and don't always encourage dissemination of dissonant views. Mr. Black, do you agree with that or not? Have a comment on that?
I think in theory it's, of course, a concern. We work towards that. We do have a system in place which we develop where we encourage innovative thinking. We use red teams, and when analysis cannot be coordinated and is compelling, that lack of coordination is so indicated. So I think we have a reasonable balance at this point. I look to the Counterterrorism Center where we have a lot of new analysts coming on board there, and we absolutely encourage unusual analysis, unusual out-of-the-box thinking. So I think, if anything, we're heading in a good direction in that area.
Mr. Watson, any comment?
We don't produce a lot of analytical reports,
Right.
so...
Should you be producing more?
Yes, we should. Absolutely. Should we have reports officers out in the field offices? You know, absolutely.
I mean, isn't that part of the problem that we're still, understandably, in a case mode, and that, you know, the long-term analysis, even the short-term analysis, sometimes no one's got time to do it.
That's correct.
That's not a priority.
Oh, I think it's a priority. I think we're getting
We're
there
getting
in
there.
the priorities. Yes, sir.
Okay. All right.
Remember, this is a large bureaucracy, and it's hard to steer the ship in a different
Right.
direction.
We just want to make sure we're moving that direction.
Okay.
My last question, gentlemen, we hear a lot of discussion since September 11th about sharing of information, not just between agencies of the federal government, but down to the local level. How do we deal with the conflicting tug and pull of wanting to share information, get back information, being able to allow people in the field to access that, while at the same time keeping the secrecy that you need to keep? We have, you know, hundreds of thousands of law enforcement agencies in this country who do a great job and who are out there and who are our eyes and ears and who are the first ones on the scene. How do we do that? And is one of the ways we do it with increased, more sophisticated technology? And let me just say with what Mr. Durbin said before you answer that, you know, I have been a proponent for more technology at the FBI. You know, it is shameful where we are. You know, the position we have put you in, Mr. Watson, is wrong. The position the FBI is in is wrong. It's wrong for the agents, and you know, I'm not satisfied with where we are going. If you could answer my question.
The information sharing piece is very important, and let me just briefly discuss how we're trying to do it in St. Louis. There is a need in any information sharing for the local police to understand what they all want to get in the fight and help us in counterterrorism and help the U.S. government. You hear that all the time. The probability of something coming up at a local police department that might prevent an act of terrorism is probably a very small percentage. But at the same time, probably the most important thing that needs to be reported and retrieved. And what we basically designed, starting back in 2000 with the information sharing, particularly through the International Association of Chief of Police, is to have this data warehouse. And the way, not the way you get around it, but the way you access it is through the JTTFs. And the JTTFs have officers, police officers from state and local jurisdictions there that have security clearances. And you can design technology so that there are different levels of information that you can ping into. But the key to information sharing is everyone loading up into that warehouse. And there are 1,000 reasons that you can be talked out of not doing that. Well, how dare you to think that some police officer might have access to FBI information? Well, how dare we not give him access to that if he stops somebody that's at an apartment complex that has some interest in us, that we would have no way to knowing about that. And then the last piece, the most critical piece, is you've got to have the technology to be able to analyze that and read that and not be a point-and-click system.
Well, let me thank both of you very much, Mr. Black, Mr. Watson, for your service to our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.